All right, so today I'm going to tackle brake lines. All the steel brake lines that go to the master cylinder. I've got these rubber lines, rubber hoses already kind of just loosely in place. We have brake masters in, you got brake light switches in. This port needs to run through this, down here, through this hole, across, around all this stuff, and then the length of the tunnel through another hole there into that junction block right there. This line will run from here. This is a nice easy one. It goes from here up into this hose. That port will go up, around, and over to the port on that side. And then in the back, same kind of a thing. I've got to run a line from this port in the junction up, around through here, and down to this brake hose here. This port here is going to come from here, jump over this little piece, or you could probably go under it. I usually go over. I think that's how Volkswagen did it. And then into this brake line here. From there, on each side, you've got to go from this brake line out along the axle and into here where the wheel cylinder is for the rear. So that's what we're working on today. Here's pretty much all the stuff I think I'm going to need to do it. I've got copper nickel line. You can use regular steel, you can use coated steel. I have all that. I use it from time to time. On this chassis, I'm just going to use copper nickel because it's the chassis is all cleaned up and this stuff looks pretty good. But the real reason is this stuff bends real easy. It's a very flexible line, and I'll be able to get pretty good results with it. I've got a pair of pliers. You can buy these anywhere that you put on the line, and then you can get a good bend on it either direction to get tight bends. This you can put on the line and get a long radius by turning it through. Tubing cutter, they come in different sizes. This I just got, I've never had one of these, but you run it on the line and it's supposed to straighten the line when you buy it on rolls like this. Normally I would just take this thing, cut it to the length I need, and then sit there and bend it and straighten it out. So I'm interested to see what kind of a job this thing does. Various wrenches, and then I've got a piece of steel wire and a measuring tape. Okay, so a little trick I learned from an old auto shop teacher I had in high school was you can take a piece of, this is just mechanics wire, run this into here. You don't want to go all the way in, but get a rough idea. And you can put a pretty good, easy bend on this. So we get a 90. I'm going to come out of this, and then I want to put another 90 across here. And I'm just trying to tuck this thing up out of the way. And the benefit of this is I can basically build this line, get it to the shape that I want it to be out here, and then nice and easy, I can take a marker, I can draw a line on that, and I know this is what my steel line needs to look like in order to go right here. And then it's very easy from there to measure this. You can measure out your steel line, flare your ends onto each side, and it'll give you a little bit of wiggle room where if you need to pull in a little further, you can just take these 90s out a little bit or add a little bit to them. But it's kind of a good tip that I learned a long time ago, and it's the way I've done when they're tricky like this, where they're real tight together, or you've got an area like coming out of here and going through this hole and then back down and around. The one that runs along the tunnel is a pretty complicated line. But I just wanted to give you this little tip on how to get this to a point where you can just kind of follow this piece of wire and make a brake line. All right, so here's our roll of copper nickel. You can see with this stuff, it is pretty easy to bend and manipulate. Gonna try out this thing, see if we can get a straight line out of it. I think the idea with this tool, I didn't really look into it at all, but the idea with this tool is to just kind of keep going along, and you'll end up, you know, if you move this around a little bit, go back and forth, you can kind of straighten this line out. It may not totally be necessary with copper nickel, but it definitely works pretty good. So that's a decent tool to pick up. I forget if I can remember where I got it. I'll throw a link on for one just so that you have an idea of the name of it and everything. Okay, so what I did is I ended up taking a tape measure and just measuring this bend from the mark. I've cut off a 7.5-inch piece of copper nickel line, and all I'm going to do here is I'm going to take it and I'm going to transfer my bends. So that bend is going to be there. This one's pretty simple because it's such a small little piece, but it's a good example, I guess. So here's my bends. I'm going to take my pliers. And you got to kind of anticipate where the center of this bend's going to be. With this type of pliers, you can kind of see that it's got a radius there that you're going to follow. So if you kind of get this lined up so it's in the middle of that area, you should be able to just give it a bend like so. And there you go. There's one section bent. And if I double check my lines, this one needs to come down. So do the same thing. Want to try to keep this as flat as possible. Get this so it's in the center of the bend. There we go. I've overbent this a little. And this worked without pre-flaring and without putting the nuts on ahead of time because of the amount of space I have here. And then you can see with the wire is so easy to bend and flexible that gets me right in the area of where I wanted to be. And if I need to open these bends up a little bit or close them up a little bit, then that's okay, I can do that. Okay, so I got my piece of line bent up and I've got my flaring tool out. Volkswagens and most European cars don't use a typical inverted flare that you would see on an American car or, you know, all other various types of vehicles. They use a bubble flare. And because of that, it actually requires a different tool to flare a bubble flare. And so this is, I have my bubble flare tool out. It's actually got metric numbers on it. And we're going, even though this is 3/16 line, we're going with 4.75 millimeters. And if you've ever flared regular line, you know that your typical flaring tool just has kind of a point. Has a point on the end of it that you use to open up the flare. Once you've used one of these style tools, this is a big one, but once you've used one of these style tips, you put that in there and then you use this to do a double flare. So this particular kit I have does metric line as well. So this is the adapter for a bubble flare. And you can see that the shape of it is very different from what, you know, typical is. It's got this extra step in it. The plate itself has an extra step down in it. So just make sure when you're flaring lines for European cars that you pay attention to what comes off the car, and it's very likely a bubble flare. Make sure you're putting a bubble flare back on it, because something that looks close is wrong. If it looks close but isn't exactly a bubble flare, then it's wrong. And you will have, over time, you may immediately have problems, but you definitely will have problems over time. So I like to, with brake line, I like to file the end so that I get a nice square edge to it, where it's a 90-degree cut. When you use those small, tubing cutters, sometimes they get kind of off to the side a little. I also like to just take the burr off the outside edge of the line. It just makes it easier for it to slide inside the tool and not get hung up and kind of bend off to the side and everything else. So there's what that looks like cleaned up. The burr is gone all the way around. This end is a factory end, so that's already clean. I've got new metric fittings. I've checked them in my brake hoses, master cylinder, everything, to make sure I have the right thread and everything. Don't forget to put the fitting on first. Obviously, you're not going to be able to slide that on. If this was a straight piece of tubing, it might not be as big of a deal. But and then I'm going to line this up in the tool. The idea here is you want to get this level with the top. Typically, when you do a double flare, you use the die as a height reference. With these bubble flare tools, you want this whole thing pretty much flat across there, and then you want to tighten these up. Get them good and tight. It's made to that size, so it's not gonna crush the line, but it will prevent it from slipping. And then this is pretty much with bubble flare. It's pretty much a one-step process. I'm gonna get my tool on here. I'm gonna lower down into the line with the pin. Make sure everything's on real straight and tight. And then I'm just gonna tighten the tool down until it bottoms out. That's bottomed out. Come back up. These types of this can be, some people are intimidated by this, and they're worried about, if they're gonna make the flare correctly and all this stuff. It's actually really simple, and if you screw it up, you chop a little off the line and you go again. So here is my bubble flare, and you can see, hopefully you can see that it's a bubble on top. It's going to come down. It's going to fit right into this fitting that has a tapered edge on the top, and that's it. And I did the short side because I'll bring you back to the chassis, but I want to test in the master cylinder, and then this, I made it a little bit longer so that I could cut this down and sneak up on it and get it as lined up as I possibly could. Okay, so I've got my piece of line here, and I'm going to thread it into the master and get it just kind of lightly seated. And then from there, I can take my hose and figure out really where my length needs to be. Let's see, the paint's a little tight on here. So if I bring this in, I know that my line is going to bottom out there. And all I'm doing is I'm just kind of checking, I'm just estimating. I know that this is going to need some cut off of it. So I'm trying to keep this as aesthetically, pleasing as possible, I guess. Again, it's not a show car, but, I do try to take some pride in the work I do. So I am going to cut this off up at that line. I'll get a nut flared onto it, and I will bring you back. Okay, I've got my bubble flare in. Didn't forget my tubing nut, which is a big part of the whole job, and we should be ready to start getting this together here. These are made so that they can be disconnected and put together during the time of screwing this line in. And I need a tubing wrench. It's over there. So this is a tubing wrench. I don't know if I've showed it before. It's got a notch in it. It's shaped, you know, so that it can go over. And the idea of it is, compared to an open-ended wrench, it will wrap around the corner and it'll actually grab all of the points, with the exception of one, right? So it grabs more of the nut than a regular wrench. And that's the whole idea of them, is it just makes it a little easier to get on this without slipping. And you don't have to tighten these crazy. I mean, you need to tighten them down, but you're going to be bleeding these brakes and you're going to be filling it with fluid and checking everything. There's no reason to really crank them down horribly and, you know, damage the line or anything else. So I got this is a 17 on the outside. And in my case, these tubing nuts, typically they're an 11 millimeter on the nut itself. The ones I purchased happen to be 12 for whatever reason. So I have a 12 and a 17. You'll probably need a 12 and an 11, or an 11 and a 17. And I'm just gonna snug these down. And like I said, if I have to, I can come back in and I can tighten that down even more if I need to. And then after that, you've got your line in. There is let me see if I can show you this. Go over here. There is a ridge. I can get it to focus. There is a ridge right here on this line. You can see it there. This clip is designed to sit in with the tab facing away from the hose, and the little feet, see those little feet on there, are intended to go in here. See if I can do it one-handed. Probably can't, but yeah, I'll bring you right back for that. Hold on. Okay. 2 hands on it. And I'm gonna get the clip. We're just gonna slide it down in there. Usually you have to push the hose in as you're pushing it down. You wanna seat it all the way. Because of the coating I've got on the pan, it's a little tough going in because of the texture. But you can tap it with a hammer. I don't have anything right here, so I'm gonna improperly use this. Yep. Okay, and that's seated there. So now we've got that 1 brake line out of 5 in there. And you can see, if you take your time and you kind of go through, map it out, you can make a pretty nice looking set of brake lines, you know, relatively cheap, relatively easy. So I'm going to run through. I'll probably bring you back when I start going with the big one, but I'm going to run through. I'll do this one, I'll do the other small ones, and then maybe bring you back. All right, so I got the brake lines all finished up. We got our line running across over to the other side there, up to in the front. The rear one, this is probably the most difficult one to do. That is in place. I got that bent, and I ended up being able to do it with 1 piece, which doesn't always happen. Sometimes you end up needing to put a junction in the middle, which is fine. I got my bend here going to the brake line. Other line going out to from the hose out to the drum. We're up and over, down on the other side, and on that piece. So pretty good. I used the wire trick I showed you. This was the last section there that I bent. It ends up working out good. You just a piece of wire, and I mean, I used this 1 wire the entire time to get all of it done. So that's it for steel brake line. I'm gonna get some fluid into this master cylinder, and let it kind of work its way through a little bit, and I will bring you back when I start bleeding it, and I'll show you the way I like to bleed them, and we'll go from there.